Hey everyone, and welcome back, finally, to the International Airport of Todos Santos. Apologies for the long break. I had originally intended to wrap up Todos Santos by the end of January. Obviously, it's not January. As you might be able to tell from the length of this video, it was a much bigger project than anticipated, and I also happened to go on a 2-week vacation right in the middle of editing it, so here we are in March. There's no long introduction today. We're just going to get into the airside details. Let's go. I wanted to start off by doing the most important thing, or at least what I saw as the most important part of this build, which is the markings for the runways. Obviously, the runways are central to the look of the airport, both up close and when you see it from a distance. So I wanted to make sure that all the decisions we made here dictated what we do for the rest of the airport rather than vice versa. We are going to work in themes rather than locations, so we're not going to detail the entire runway and then move on to the taxiways or anything like that. We're going to do the markings, and then we're going to do markings for other areas. We'll come back later and do things like lighting and all those sorts of details. And I think that's going to make it a little bit more interesting to watch, hopefully, but it definitely made it easier to build. Mostly because I could basically just get into the flow of doing markings, get all those done, grind those out, and then move on to the next thing, as opposed to having to restart over and over again doing the same thing multiple times. It just gets old, and yeah, I think it was just more efficient to do it this way. So I'm starting with the most detail-dense part of the runway, which is the threshold area. So you have the threshold marking here, which identifies the width of the runway, and I think also where you could begin touching down. And then over here on the left, we have the displaced threshold, which I believe you can use for takeoff, but not for landing. Now for the runway center line, I decided to use these props. They're actually meant to be centerline measures, so you can do the center lines in IMT and then line them up with the measures, but I decided just to use the measuring stick as the center line. But it just ended up being a little easier, honestly, than using IMT because of the way, basically in IMT, each segment resets the spacing, so it's a little more tedious to go in and adjust the spacing for each segment in IMT versus just copying and pasting all of these centerline props. And of course, we have the runway numbering. For these two parallel runways, on this side, they are 1-1 left and 1-1 right. Definitely in the wrong configuration at first. Just going to adjust those. It kind of makes sense that you wouldn't want the left and right identifiers right next to the numbers because they might, you could easily mistake the R for an 8 or the L for a 1, that kind of thing. I'm assuming that's why they do it like this. So at this point, I had a pretty good idea of how we're going to go through and detail all these blank, ugly stretches of runway and taxiway. But I did need to go through and adjust most of the intersections with node controller. So I'm bringing them up to an offset of about 50 when it's possible, just because I think that looks a little bit more natural. It looks kind of awkward to have these sharp intersections where these massive planes are going to need to be turning. So I'm just doing that where I can to get these nice, smooth curves at the intersections. Over on the other side of these parallel runways, basically recreating the exact same details, obviously, except instead of runway 1-1 left and right, on this side we have runway 2-9er left and right. I think they say 9 is 9er, pretty sure. I'm not at all well-versed in aviation, so I'm sure I'm going to mix up some of these terms. Do let me know if I get anything too wrong. I decided not to do the displaced threshold on this runway or on the other side of the parallel runways, just because there's simply not enough space to do this. Also, there's definitely not supposed to be planes landing on this runway, so I don't know why that happened. But anyway, this is runway 05. And then on the other side, it's runway 23. Very quickly, back over at the displaced thresholds, they have a very distinctive feature, which is like these arrows pointing at the runway, which it just seems very distinctive and kind of iconic for some reason. So those are pretty straightforward, just using those same arrow props. And then we have something that's probably even more distinctive than those, which is, well, actually, I'm not sure if it's a blast pad or a stopway. They both kind of look the same. They're in the same position. For our purposes, it really doesn't matter. It's a cool little thing with some yellow chevrons on it. Of course, I'm using a network and IMT to do it, so we get this ugly rounded edge. So I'm just going to cover that up with some ploppable grass. Even though we're a little short on space for the other runways, this thing looks so cool that I'm going to take it and copy and paste it onto the end of every single runway.
cada día.
We have this really awkward spot where we have all three runways intersecting with one another. I'm sure I'm going to break all sorts of regulations here. Please don't report me. Basically, the only information I had on how this sort of thing is handled is that the runways that are considered primary runways, their markings are going to supersede the secondary runways. So I tried to do that here where we have the parallel runways being obviously the primary ones, and then this dark runway, which actually isn't used by the planes, is secondary. But we do have these kind of faded lines indicating that maybe a long time ago, like when this was a 3-runway airport during the war, this might have been the primary runway. I'm not really sure about that, but I think it looks kind of cool, and it's a way to solve the problem. So, lacking better information, that's what I came up with. Now we have a few more markings. So we have these which indicate the touchdown zone, basically the area where the planes are going to touch down, of course. And those taper down from a set of 3 white lines down to 2, down to 1. And then they also have these big white boxes interspersed in there. Those are aiming points, which I think are pretty self-explanatory. Finally, as you might expect, we're going to take these and have them going the other way as well. Even though we don't actually have planes landing in that direction, but, you know, just for appearance's sake. Need to really quickly make some adjustments to our markings here so that the primary runway supersedes the secondary runway, and then we're going to do the same thing for this smaller unused runway. Now, if I remember correctly, there's a regulation saying that you can't have touchdown markings for a certain length at the center of the runway, so I'm just going to measure that out and get rid of any ones that are in that area. Okay, the next step for the runways are these runway shoulder markings. Now, apparently these aren't widely used, but I think they look really cool, so we're going to use them. And they basically just indicate that planes shouldn't use this part of the pavement. Sometimes you see them as a different color or type of concrete or asphalt than the runway, and that's what I tried at first, but I think it ends up looking a little bit too high contrast. So I originally used these dark runway shoulder markings. I'm going to come back later and adjust them so that the color matches the runways, which I think ends up looking a little bit nicer. Now, closely related to these are the taxiway shoulder markings. Apparently these are a lot more common. They're pretty similar, just a smaller width of pavement and straight yellow lines instead of angled yellow lines. I just have to do all of it manually, which is a little bit annoying, but they don't work in IMT. They're not technically like decorative networks. So we're just gonna have to do some good old-fashioned move it. But luckily the runways and taxiways kind of operate in patterns. So once I get these various templates of shoulder markings, I can just take them and copy and paste them all over, just making minor adjustments here and there as needed. Next step, not surprisingly, are the taxiway markings. These are actually going to be a little bit more difficult to do than the runway markings. Obviously, the runway ones are just plain white lines, so that's very easy to do in IMT. But the taxiway edge markings here are a little bit more complex. They have this black background and then 2 parallel yellow lines on it. So first, I just try using a plain yellow double line in IMT. And that's what I go with at first, but it doesn't quite look right. So we're going to come back later, and I realize that I have some prop versions of these that look more accurate. So we're going to replace those later on. But first we have the taxiway center lines, which are more straightforward, just a yellow line. And we also have the holding positions, and these are these kind of fancy markings telling you that you're about to go onto the runway, and that's where you stop before you get clearance to take off. And these, I think it's easiest just to do with these props, turning them into POs so I can get them into a nice, perfectly straight line. And then we can just take this and copy and paste it to all the other runway holding positions as we go through these taxiways. Leading up to the holding positions, we have, I think these are called the enhanced center lines, and this just indicates that you're approaching a holding position. There are all kinds of regulations for this sort of thing. I'm not too worried about like getting all these absolutely perfect to, they have to be a certain length within a certain distance of the holding position, that kind of stuff. I'm not too worried about getting that stuff accurate. I just want something that looks, like I said before, believable. Sometimes you get these complicated intersections, which are a little bit tougher to make, but I think they look really cool, and they just have that iconic taxiway look to them. And luckily, I don't really have to make them over and over again by hand, because with a little fiddling around in IMT, I can just copy and paste them when you have mirrored versions like this. It also gets a little bit interesting where the taxiway center lines go out onto the runway to guide planes in or out of the runway, especially on these high-speed taxiway exits. I think those look really cool. I also think this is where all these different networks and stuff we've been putting down are starting to get tied together, and you can kind of see them as one giant web instead of just all these individual pieces that don't really fit together. One thing you might have noticed is that a lot of the different surfaces, the taxiways and the runways and the apron at different points in the airport are totally different textures, and that's something we're going to dedicate a whole portion of the episode later on, but I wanted to get started as I was noticing some of these areas, like this little crescent-shaped piece of grass here. That doesn't really make sense, so I'm going to try to cover that up and try to blend some of these textures together a little bit better, just to make it look like these are purposefully different materials. And that's not, again, we're going to go way into detail into that later, but I wanted to just start that as I was taking these details we've been doing and applying them to the entire airport. There were some parts, like this massive 5-way intersection right next to all 3 of the runways, where I didn't really know how to manage the holding positions, so I kind of just winged it. And I just assumed that they would have the holding positions before the intersection, so you would stop there, wait for your clearance, and then get onto the runway from there. I don't know if that's actually how it works, but it's how they do it at the Todos Santos airport. Other than that, it was pretty straightforward. Just a little bit of busy work, which I'm not going to subject you to, well, at least not in full. Lastly, there's one more taxiway marking to do, which is the taxiway edge markings where planes are going to be turning, or at least able to turn, off of the taxiway onto the apron or wherever. And that's basically the exact same thing as the normal taxiway edge line, except it's dashed. So at this point, I had figured out that I had these props available, which I could use in IMT. So I just made up a line with an arbitrary amount of spacing, or not arbitrary, I chose a spacing that looked about right compared to pictures that I'd seen, and copied and pasted that all the way along the edge of the taxiway where we're going to have pavement on the other side. Obviously, all of this is just grass right now. Again, we're going to have a whole section of the episode dedicated to the surfaces. I also, off camera at this point, had replaced most of the IMT solid taxiway edge markings with the prop version, which looks a lot nicer. As you may have noticed, we've been moving from the runways toward the terminals, so now it's time to work on the apron. I'm starting with the service vehicle road. So for the most part, I'm just having this thing run parallel to the taxiway that's nearest to the apron, trying to give enough space so that the plane's wingspans don't actually overlap with the service road. It's not always going to be perfect, but I'm just trying my best to do that. I'm just starting with a quick and dirty loop that goes all the way around the airport, bridges over this gap where the transit center is, and I'm just trying to make sure it has access to all the concourses. I'm also connecting it up to the secure entrance that we made last episode. And then I'm going to do another pass and add in these offshoots that go into the indents in between the concourses. The exact route of this road network is going to change a little bit once we get into the actual detailing, because I'm going to get a better sense of how big these plane stands are, how much space they need, and versus how much space the service road needs. But we're just getting a general sense of where everything's going to go, and then everything's going to shift into place as we get more and more into the details. And obviously the route of the service road is going to be secondary to the plane stands, which are much more important to the look and the functioning of the airport. And the service road doesn't just access the terminals and the outside world, it also surrounds the entire airport. So we're going to have one running all the way around the taxiways and runways. There's also the problem of I think it's called the safety zone. You're basically going to have a certain amount of space surrounding the runway where you probably shouldn't have any obstacles or roads or that kind of stuff. I don't have the numbers on me right now, but I did measure out the amount of space that I needed and basically had the service road running at minimum at that distance where it was possible. Obviously, I'm not too worried about cheating a little bit here and there just to make it a little easier on myself, because theoretically I could make it a little bit more realistic and shift this road out into the water and extend the shoreline, but then we'd have tsunamis and all that stuff. So yeah, basically I do cheat a little bit here and there, but I try to get it to look believable enough. We just need to connect this up over at the other end of the airport, and then it's time to throw down a few quick details for the service roads, primarily consisting of where we have intersections. So I'm using IMT to get these white stop bars, and then I'm using PO to make these red stop labels on the pavement. I tried doing that part in IMT and I just couldn't get it to work, so I figured it was just easier to go around, copy and paste these things with PO. One thing I noticed looking at quite a few airports is that they have a different line texture where service roads cross taxiways. So I'm using this nice zipper or checker pattern, which I think looks really cool. And I also add these same painted stop signs at these as well, because obviously you're going to want the vehicles to stop before they cross an active taxiway. Finally, for the service road, there is the non-movement area boundary, which, as far as I can tell, basically identifies the point where if you cross it onto the taxiway, you have to have clearance from ATC. Whereas on the other side, you can kind of just do whatever you want, in a manner of speaking, at least. So for the most part, I'm just having that coincident with the edge of the service road. That's something I noticed in some airports as well, is that they'll just have these two things line up. It also, coincidentally, makes it very easy for me to make with IMT. And then on the rare occasion where we do have some gaps in the service road, I just use the prop version. So now that we have the entire apron encapsulated by this beautiful black and yellow line, we're going to get to detailing the apron, and we're going to start with what ended up being my favorite part of the build, which is the plane stands. I'm going to go ahead and slow down the footage a little bit compared to the 4x speed that we've been running at, because there are a lot of different details and moving parts in this that I want to explain. I'm using a wide variety of assets, starting with the, I forget the name, but it's basically the outline of where the plane parks. The props I had are just a single color, so I had to turn them into POs, combine two of them, and change the color so that we can have this red and white dual color line. Just because that's what I've seen the most in my research looking at different airports. Occasionally you do find ones, at least that I've seen, that are pure white or pure red, but we're going to do the dual colors because they look cooler. The next part of the plane stand is the stop bar. You can notice this one has indications for various different planes. The workshop page handily comes with a reference guide for the lengths of different planes, so I'm going to use that to figure out which sorts of planes are going to be able to park in which stands. I'm not going for 100% realism. I'm going to try to make it as accurate as is possible for a lay idiot like me. Of course, we also have the jet bridges. Thankfully, this asset pack comes with some pre-made versions. It also comes with the individual parts, so you can make your own with the right angle and the right length and everything like that. I'm just going to use the pre-made ones and add this little thing, this door thing on the end. They're also supposed to come with canopy pieces, like the little accordion bit on the end that makes a nice tight seal with the aircraft. For some reason, those don't show up in my game, and I've seen that some other people have that problem with the asset as well. So unfortunately, we're just going to have to skip those and leave them out, which kind of sucks because they really look cool and they add that nice, just that nice little touch to each plane stand, but we're just going to have to skip those. I do have to extend out the plane stand decals a little bit, and I'm also going to use PO to pull out this stop bar decal over the service road, I guess so it's just more visible from the taxiway. Luckily, all of this stuff is selectable in Move It, so we're just going to copy and paste all of this as needed. Of course, we're going to have to make some changes as we go. But for the most part, that's going to make this process a lot easier. As we go through all the concourses, I'm going to try to have the plane stands in various states of use. So some of them currently have parked planes that are boarding, some of them have parked planes that are about to depart or have just arrived, and some of them totally empty. Some of them are going to be active, and we're going to add these functioning plane stands. I figured this was as good a time as any to figure out which airlines I'm going to actually have servicing this airport and which concourses they're going to be housed in. So I decide this one is going to be Flux Transport. And to do that, I'm first of all putting down some prop planes at each of the plane stands that is occupied. And I'm also using the vehicle selector mod on the functional plane stand and making sure that only Flux Transport planes can come to and from this plane stand. And it works really well. We get the proper planes going to and from this stand, and likewise for all the other ones that we're going to add as well. This part was a detail that I was not looking forward to doing. At first, I thought I could get away with it and just kind of not mention it. But yeah, I realized that it just didn't look right without these red stripes. I think this is identifying like the area where the jetway goes back and forth, so you don't want to have like random stuff sitting there so that it gets hit by the jetway. So we're just going to do a bunch of red lines by hand using PO. Another detail I realized I needed to do was that the glass on the concourses didn't really line up with where the gates would be. So if you were sitting there, you wouldn't have a window. So I'm just adding another copy of the building that I used in procedural objects and lowering it down, squeezing it down so that we have the windows lined up with where the gates would be. So you can actually see out over the apron while you're sitting there waiting for your plane, which is honestly one of the best parts of being at an airport anyway. So I wanted to make sure that that was the case here, and I'm going to make similar adjustments over the rest of the airport as we add more details to the other concourses. Which coincidentally, I guess I have good timing, is what we're going to do right now.
Bueno, sí. Camina. Rico, rico, rico. Y como dice mi coro que sigue ahí. Escucha mi salsa buena, abre la ventana. Escucha. Ahora estamos gozando hasta la mañana. Escucha mi salsa buena, abre la ventana. Ahora estamos gozando hasta la mañana. Melodía, melodía. Escucha mi salsa buena, abre la ventana. Ay, escucha mi salsa ahora. Ahora estamos gozando para bailar, para gozar. Qué rico está. Escucha mi salsa buena. Ay, yo te traigo la salsa buena, es la verdad. Ahora estamos gozando hasta la mañana. Bueno, mira, escucha ahora. Ja. Si escucha mi salsa ahora, mi salsa para bailar. Este ritmo tan sabroso, el ritmo para guarachar. Yo te canto con sentimiento y manana te lo voy a dar. Muévese con sabrosura, abre la ventana para respirar. Escucha mi salsa buena, abre la ventana. Yo te traigo la salsa buena. Estamos gozando hasta la mañana. Estamos gozando ahí.
So we've taken care of the first 3 concourses, which are a lot smaller, and accordingly, they service the smaller airlines. Now we're moving on to the most recent addition to the airport, which is this long, modern terminal, and this is going to serve the 2 largest airlines, which are going to be CS Airlines on this side, and then on the other side, we're going to have Skylines, which is the name of the airline, Skylines. I haven't mentioned it yet, but all of these plane vehicles and props are by B. Squeichelhausen, and they are so good. They just look so awesome, especially once we get to the cinematics. They really have nice details, nice texture, and they work really well with the lighting. Just in case you were interested in those or any of the other airport-specific assets that I'm using for this build, there's a link down in the description. I made a dedicated Steam Workshop page just for this. The only real thing I'm doing differently for these stands as compared to the ones we've already made are that I'm adding these little blank spots in the wall. So I'm kind of doing the reverse of what we did before. Before I had to add windows to make it look like there were actually gates there. Now because this asset is the perfect size and shape for what I wanted, it already has windows in the right place. But it looks awkward to have the jet bridges just sticking out of the glass, so I'm adding these little additions to the jetways when I need them. You might have also seen in the earlier montage, I had one plane stand that was dedicated to these larger CS Airlines jets. Not sure exactly what plane it's supposed to resemble, but one of the big ones, let's just call it that. Obviously, CS Airlines is turning into probably the largest airline at this airport because it has basically more than half of this long concourse dedicated to it and half of one of the other ones. So I figured that that would mean they would probably have some more of these larger jets. So to line up with that, I wanted to add a functional plane stand servicing one of these larger jets. It also presents an interesting detailing opportunity in that we get to have these dual jetways, which I think look really cool. And it just kind of breaks up the monotony of having the same size jet over and over again parked at these stands. So on the other side of this concourse, I tried adding some functional Skylines plane stands, and for some reason the planes wouldn't spawn. But I decided to just move forward with the detailing and hope that it worked itself out. So I did the details pretty much the exact same way as I did for the CS Airlines side of the concourse, and that turned out well, and then I started on the next concourse, and this is when I figured out what was happening. When I tried to connect up the next functional plane stand to the taxiway system, I couldn't. And I couldn't do that because we hit the node limit. Actually, we're going to fix this. I tried a few different things at first, like trying to get rid of excess nodes on roads that aren't really used that often. I did the same thing with roads that I used for terraforming, and also for certain kinds of decorative networks. But none of that really made enough of a dent in the number. What I eventually settled on was very similar to what I did to fix our building limit problem back in episode 68. So I'm not going to go through the whole process, but basically what I did is I used Find It to identify networks that I had put down a lot of. Now, it doesn't actually quantify like how many instances or how many nodes of a certain network you've used, but I kind of just know from having been the one who built the city, I know where all these networks are, how they're used, and about how much I use them. So the ones I honed in on were the vanilla pedestrian paths, which I've been using very frequently, essentially as invisible pedestrian paths to get people to use custom plazas or to walk through buildings, to take shortcuts through buildings, that kind of stuff. So using Find It, I went through, found as many of the instances as I realistically could, where it doesn't affect the aesthetics of the city to remove the networks, and I would just delete them. And eventually we came up with a nice number of nodes available now. Freed up over 1,000, which I think should get us to the end of the series, hopefully. And I was able to connect it up, and all the planes started spawning, as they should. So something to do with being near the node limit stopped planes from spawning. I guess that makes sense. So with that taken care of, I got back to detailing, finished up this concourse, and now it's time to move on to the international terminal. Of course, for the international terminal, I'm using much larger jets here, so I can just take this plane stand that I made for the ones over in the CS Airlines concourse and reuse them for the international terminal. I don't think that there would be a big presence of international flights here, especially on jets this large, like the transcontinental sorts of flights. But I did want to have a few of these here just because these planes look so cool. So we can only fit 4 gates in here. It's actually going to end up being 3 for reasons we'll get to later, but I think you can see how we're very limited on space here, and it's honestly probably a lot smaller than it should be, but it's what we have space for, and it's what we have, so I'm just going to detail it up much like the other ones, except all of these are going to get the double jetways, which looks really nice. It's kind of hard to fit the jetway assets into the vanilla terminal building because the glass is at this very sharp angle. So I'm not worrying too much about it, just trying to clip them into the glass and then adding these, I think that is the rotunda piece that connects up with the glass. And that kind of just covers up the ugliness just a little bit. So at this point, I think the airport is coming along, but there's something missing. At present, the surfaces of the airport are either looking too coherent in certain places or too mismatched. Now, if you look at airports, you see lots of different kinds of surfaces, and at least from my research, I've gleaned that concrete and asphalt are the 2 main surfaces you'll find. And the difference between these, at least the visual difference, is made very obvious looking at the San Juan airport. So I'm going to go for a look that resembles this. From what I've found, generally concrete is better for holding static weight. So if a plane is going to be sitting somewhere, like at a plane stand or on a taxiway waiting to taxi onto the runway, then it's better to have concrete. And for surfaces that are going to have lots of movement across it, like a long stretch of taxiway or, of course, the runways, generally asphalt is better. Of course, there are also many other differences between them that I'm not going to get into now. Really, all we need to know is what kinds of areas you're going to find the different surfaces. Concrete slabs on these shorter stretches of taxiway leading up to the runways, and for the plane stands as well. And then the rest of it is just going to be various colors of asphalt. I pretty quickly figured out that using IMT, is, in most instances at least, is the best way to get this concrete slab look. There were some areas where, because of some of these fake intersections that I had to make, I wasn't able to use IMT, or it just didn't work out. So I usually just use PO. And I take that opportunity to have some different color variations. So it looks like these concrete slabs have been installed at different times. They've had to resurface various areas. So there are different amounts of wear and tear, slightly different formulations maybe of the concrete. And I also take this opportunity while I'm working on the surfaces to replace the side markings. Like I mentioned before, I just thought it was a little bit too high contrast with the dark asphalt on the side. So I just wanted to kind of even that out. And I think it looks a little bit cleaner that way. We already have all the base surfaces for the asphalt laid down, but it looks a little plain. You get tiling textures, just a little boring, so we need to add some wear and tear. We're going to come back to the runways in just a second, but I'm going to start with these aptly named wear decals and just run them down the center line of all the taxiways, and that's just going to give them that little extra bit of texture. All right, with the easy stuff out of the way, we're going to go back to the runway, and it's going to be a little bit more varied and challenging to do this. So I don't know if this is something that actually happens, but basically what I'm doing here is trying to resemble that there's a little bit more wear and tear where the jets are taking off or touching down. I don't know if that's really something that affects a runway like this, but I think it looks kind of cool, so we're going to go with this, just using a couple different decals and coloring them with PO, so we can get a nice, consistent color scheme. Most of the runway imagery I looked at shows a lot more wear and tear, or at least I think that's what it is, on the center of the runway, which makes sense because planes are generally not going to be driving on the outside parts of the runway, at least hopefully. So I'm going to represent that. I'm going to try to do it somewhat subtly with different sets of decals. So we get this kind of smoother wear decal on the outside part of the runway. And then because I want to resize these next decals, I'm going to use IMT, which makes it a lot easier to resize multiple decals. And I'm going to make 3 rules, so we have this intermediate level of wear on the side. And then in the middle, we're going to have the most aggressively textured wear decal, where most of the degradation to the asphalt is going to be occurring. It's a little subtle on the lighter runways, but I think it looks really nice on the dark one. I do really love how these slab decals look, but this is the point where they become the bane of my airport existence. So I had already figured out that turning them into POs doesn't really help the situation, because they retain their decalness, their infuriating ability to resist raising them and lowering them with Move It, or PO. So I decided to just move forward using them as plain old decals, and they seem to work at first. All the other markings appear correctly on top of them. It looks all good. So you might be wondering, like, why am I even talking about this? What is actually wrong with them?
Ceci est l'histoire d'un homme marqué par une image d'enfance. La scène qui le troubla par sa violence et dont il ne devait comprendre que beaucoup plus tard la signification, eut lieu sur la grande jetée d'Orly, quelques années avant le début de la Troisième Guerre mondiale.
So basically the problem is that every time I would reload the game, some areas of these decals and POs that we use to make the plane stand details do this weird Z fighting with the decals that I put down for the concrete slabs. No matter what combination of decals and POs I used, I couldn't get this to go away. So what I end up doing is just deleting all the tiles that are directly underneath the red and white decals for the plane stands, and I replace them with prop versions turned into POs, which I just have to lower down a little bit, and then we get a nice non-Z fighting situation. It does end up looking a little repetitive to have these same shapes of props versus the tile decals over and over again, so I do vary it up a little bit just to make it look more random. Like some of these concrete tiles have been replaced over time, like the most worn ones have been replaced more often. The least worn areas get resurfaced less often. Pretty self-explanatory. So we're going to jump back in time just a little bit to before I figured this problem out, when I was just laying down the normal decals. The process of putting down these concrete slabs is just to get this ring of concrete around the terminal. And that's something you'll see at a lot of airports. I assume for the same reasons I talked about before on the difference between concrete and asphalt. And I think it results in a very distinctive and airporty kind of look. So with the concrete slabs taken care of, the next problem we run into is this big empty area. It looks kind of ugly just having this repetitive plain ground texture. So I decided to add a few remote stands, just copying and pasting the outline that I made before, and adding a new surface underneath, thinking that for whatever reason they don't want to have the concrete slabs underneath here. So they have patches of asphalt that they've paved more recently than the surrounding areas, because it gets worn down a lot more easily with all the planes coming and going to these stands. We even have a functional one right in the middle here. And I set it to spawn just these small regional jets, which we don't have a lot of sitting at the plane stands. And we're going to decorate those up further in a minute. But before we get to that, I wanted to spruce up the plain asphalt texture with a whole bunch of wear decals. I did a couple passes of this. You're just seeing the very first quick one where I get the majority of the details down. I also came back and added some additional things like some oil stains, some tire marks, that kind of stuff. It's pretty subtle, but I think it does well enough to break up the monotony of the theme's asphalt texture. Finally, there was this additional giant space of empty asphalt. I decided just to get rid of that and add another area where they have these taxiway side markings and an area of grass in between. There wasn't really any need for planes to cross here. I suppose you theoretically could have an additional taxiway or something, but I didn't feel like adding that. So it just turned into grass, and I just needed to very quickly adjust all the details to fit the new structure here. We have some more things we have to do to get these gates up to snuff, and we're going to do them in a few passes. And first off, I'm going to make sure that every single one of these gates is named, numbered, identified, whatever the term would be. So we're starting with Concourse A, and we're just going to go counterclockwise around the airport from here all the way to the international terminal. So of course, we're starting with Concourse A. This is gate A1. So we're going to have an identifier up here. I'm just using these taxiway sign props that are made to be used with procedural objects. They have the right color, they're lit up, so I think they work perfectly for this situation. And then we're also going to have an identifier down here on the ground, and I'm just taking the exact same thing, rotating it, sizing it up, and flattening it down so it looks more or less like it's painted on the ground. And I'm just attaching that to the end of each of our stop bars that we already have placed down. As necessary, I also added these little physical bump outs to the concourses, because sometimes it just looks a little strange to have the jetways just sticking right out of the glass. So we're just going to take this whole theme, copy and paste things all over the concourse until we have A1 through A4. Pretty small concourse, just 4 gates, but that's the space we have. Now, after Concourse A, I tried to do a cool Dirty H style time lapse. Yeah, it's definitely something that I tried. So we have Concourse B, which serves strict toast air with 5 gates. Then there's Concourse C with 7 gates, 4 of them serving Jet BSQ, and 3 of them serving CS Airlines. Next we have the beautiful and quite new D Concourse with lots of gates. I frankly am not going to count them. Just over half of them are used by CS Airlines, and the remainder are used by Skylines, which honestly is my favorite livery out of all of these. Obviously it's meant to represent Southwest. I just think these look so cool. Concourse E is home to 6 gates, all of them serving San Miniato Air, which of course is meant to represent Alaska Airlines. There's Concourse F, no comment. And then there's the international terminal as well. I decided to designate this one Concourse I, which I don't think is something that's actually used because the I looks so much like 1. I figured rather than just continuing alphabetically with G, it wouldn't hurt to skip over couple nav I, since it is, after all, the international terminal. So the next pass is going to be all the vehicles, machines, and miscellany that you need to get planes up and running. Now, as I mentioned before, I'm not too knowledgeable about everything that goes into the working of an airport, but I try to do a little bit of research and figure out the general categories of things that you're going to see on the apron. So we have a couple different systems for fueling. At this newer terminal, I figured that they would have these underground tanks, I suppose, and you just have a vehicle pumped directly out of that. Whereas at the smaller concourses, they have to have a truck full of fuel go up and pump directly into the plane's tanks. We also have these pushback tugs, I think, and these bars as well, so they can push the planes back onto the taxiway. Of course, we have baggage tugs and all these carts as well, and a bunch of random vehicles. Whenever I didn't know what to put and I needed some clutter, I would just put some pickup trucks and some of these airside service vehicles and security vehicles as well. Just like we did with the jetways, I wanted to have all these clutter props show that the planes are in various stages of landing, taxiing, parking, and taking off. So this one basically has everything going on right now. It's being refueled. The pushback tug is lining up. It's one of these ones that doesn't have the tow bar piece. It's like a fancier version of that. And then, of course, we also have luggage being loaded on. I did want to break it up occasionally and have some different facilities on the apron. So here we have these giant HVAC units that for some reason are on the ground instead of the roof. And we also have a bunch of miscellaneous parked vehicles. But for the most part, it's just placing the same stuff over and over and over again. The biggest problem with this, other than me having absolutely no idea how these things are supposed to be arranged on the apron, of course, is that they're all completely static. And obviously at an airport, you can have tons of vehicles driving around to various destinations pretty much all the time. So we're going to add some bus lines. I'm adding an invisible bus depot that's just going to serve all these bus lines. And then I'm going to add several different lines. So we have one that serves luggage tugs. So I don't think it looks very realistic to just have the luggage carts stopping behind the plane. That doesn't really make sense. I'm going to make these little loops occasionally that go into the areas in between the plane stands, and I'm going to curve it so that it can stop at the proper location so that they can actually load the baggage onto these little baggage ramp props. I'm not going to do this for every plane stand because that would just be very tedious to go in and micromanage each individual one. I'm just going to do the occasional one so we can simulate some sort of activity. It was probably the most satisfying and easy to connect it up with these remote stands because I could just have the road running right through there. There's a service road right next to it anyway. I'm also going to take this opportunity while we're over here to detail it up like I promised before. And then I'm just going to take this theme and repeat it, just like we've been doing with everything else, throughout the entire airport. Now, I also happen to have some areas where the service road runs through the airport, and this is basically just to simulate that occasionally you'll get vehicles popping out of these garage doors on the lower level of the concourses. Over at the international terminal, we have the convenient option to run the service road underneath the jetways, which is something I've actually noticed at a lot of airports. We didn't do it at this one for the most part, obviously, but we do get to do it here at the international terminal, which makes this sort of thing a lot easier because I don't have to make the little loops going in between each plane stand. So the next bus line that we're going to make is going to serve airport security. And after the fact, I also decided to have the same line also serve these generic airside service vehicles. The next line up is for pushback tugs, which is basically going to take the exact same route as the baggage carts, except it's going to stop a little earlier, so it stops closer to the noses of the planes, as opposed to the wings. Next up are the stair cars, which are going to get a line all to themselves because we're not going to be using them too much. Most of these planes have available jetways, but especially for these remote stands and a couple of the plane stands up against the main concourses, we do need those, so I wanted to have them running around. Unfortunately, I couldn't get the stair car on this bus line because the asset that's on the workshop is not technically a bus. This was actually one of the first assets that I ever downloaded for the game. So I wish I'd been able to get this in, but maybe I'll grab a few of those props and hide them around the airport. The very last bus line is something that I'd completely forgotten about up until this point, which are the catering trucks. For some reason, I didn't even have these in my collection, so I had to go and download those. So we're going to give them a bus line, get those running around, and I'm also going to add some here and there as prop versions. With all of that taken care of, we just need to go through concourse B and C here, add some clutter, and moving clockwise this time, concourse A as well. Totally jumping out of order to concourse E. And the international terminal to finish off the clutter details. Now we're pretty much done with the terminal and the apron, and we're going to shift our attention back to the runways and taxiways. We're going to start with some directional signage. So I began this part of the project by coming up with some designations for our taxiways. I tried to align these with real-life practices. If you want to pause and evaluate, you can do that. Otherwise, we're going to get started on applying these names via signs. There's a set of taxiway signage props that are meant to be turned into POs. We've already used those for the gate designations. I'm going to do the same thing for the runways and taxiways. So apparently at intersections between taxiways and runways, there will be a red sign indicating which runway you're turning onto. Of course, technically each runway is designated as 2 runways depending on which direction you're going. And then at this sort of intersection, and actually any intersection, you'll have a black sign indicating which taxiway you're on. So in this example, you're on taxiway A1, you're heading toward runway 11 if you turn left, and runway 29er if you take a right. Of course, I pretty quickly figured out that that is completely incorrect. When I was doing the next taxiway sign, I realized that there's a left and a right version of each of these runways, so I had to adjust that accordingly. For some reason, the font I was using for this has this, I don't know if it's intentional or if this is how it is in real life, but the text is on like a different level than the numbers, which looks kind of interesting. I just don't know if it's supposed to be like that, but nothing really I can do about that doesn't involve doing multiple text boxes per sign, which just sounds like a pain. So I'm not going to do that, and we're going to leave it as is, unless everybody sounds off in the comments and tells me how horrible it looks and how unrealistic it is. Then I might go back and fix it. We'll see. So I tried a few different ways of repeating these all over the airport, because we have to do dozens of these. Obviously, there are many different intersections that we have to sign. So I tried copying and pasting with Move It, and I also tried creating presets in PO, and I honestly think it's just easier to copy and paste them with Move It, and then go back through and adjust the titles of the signs accordingly. I think that's the most efficient way to do it. So I think you get the idea with that. The only real variation on the runway signs is that at the very end, when you don't really have space to turn left or right on one of the runways, you'll just have a single runway designation. The taxiway signs are quite similar. You still have the sign that indicates which taxiway you're on, and then you have yellow signs indicating what your options are if you're turning. So in this instance, we're on taxiway D. You can turn left onto C or right onto C. That one's pretty straightforward. But they do get a little more complicated. Sometimes you have multiple options, so you could go at a wide angle in one direction, or you can turn at a right angle in one direction. I think you get the idea. It can get a little more complicated than just left or right. At some of these intersections, you get some really complicated and cool looking signs. But overall, I just do the exact same process, copying and pasting with Move It and adjusting as needed. And I finished off this part of the build with the softball, which is taxiway F, because it's basically just the same thing over and over again, going up one number for each successive taxiway. Luckily, because the Earth happens to spin around on an axis, we're not done with the video yet, because we have to do a lot of lighting. I'm starting back at our favorite spot, the displaced threshold of runway 11 right, and I'm going to try to work our way back and forth until we get something resembling a realistic layout of runway lighting. So for the displaced threshold, you have red lights shining one direction, saying you probably shouldn't land here, and yellow lights shining the other way, I assume indicating that you're about to run off the runway. You also have these bigger, brighter lights at the end, red ones indicating that, again, it's the displaced threshold, and then green ones here, and they're shifted out to the side. This basically indicates the beginning of the touchdown zone. I believe these are called threshold lights. I could be wrong about that, though. It's a little different over on the other sides of the runway where we don't have the displaced thresholds. You just have the red and green ones right next to each other, right on top of the threshold. Now for the runway edge lights, it varies depending on where you are on the runway. So I don't remember the exact numbers, but for the first 1,000 feet or something like that, you have yellow lights. I didn't have any yellow lights that were specifically made to resemble airport lights, so I'm just using some generic orangey lights that I had on hand. Not ideal, but it's the only option I have, so we're going to do that. And I'm just spacing them out, not at any particular distance, just so it looks reasonable and fits into each given part of the runway. So I'm doing that on both sides of the runway. And once we take care of that, we get to the normal white runway edge lights, which fill up the remainder of the edge of the runway. Now for the center lines, similar thing, the very end of the runway, all of these center line lights are red. Then for the next portion, you have alternating red and white, so I'm just doubling the spacing. I'm going to draw out the red ones, and then go halfway in between those and draw out the white ones. To nobody's surprise, we're going to complete that by filling in the middle with plain white lights. Then we have the touchdown zone lights, which not surprisingly go on top, essentially on top of the touchdown zone markings. And this is parallel sets of 3 lights. They end up looking really bright, so even though I have them properly spaced out, the correct distance that you have to on a runway like this, I end up deleting every other set because they just look way too bright. So even though I end up with an improper spacing, they look cooler. So that's essentially it for the runway lights, and now we're going to move on to the taxiway lights. Taxiway centerline lights are green, and the only options I found for green airport lights were either buildings or networks. Something to do with the way props work, they just don't have an option for green light, something like that. Instead of placing one building at a time, I'm going with the network version, despite our issue with the node limit. It's really not going to be too many nodes, and it's such an important part of the look of the airport. I mean, as you can see, it's just like so cool. Now, one downside to using the network version is that it doesn't function in IMT. It's not that sort of decorative network. So I have to manually place this across the top of every single stretch of taxiway center line. It wasn't as tedious as I thought. It was actually kind of fun. And I just enjoyed watching all these green lights connect up and this whole network of lights come together. Taxiway edge lights are blue. They're a deeper blue usually than the props that I found on the workshop, but I think they look cool enough, so they're going to work just fine for this project. The process of putting them down is going to be quite a bit different because they do work with IMT. So there are going to be certain instances where on some of these curved portions, it's a lot easier to use IMT, I think, to put them down. And then for these long straightaways and certain broader curves or instances where we have these fake intersections where I can't actually use IMT to put them down, then it's just easier to use the prop version and drag them out with the prop line tool. I did settle on mostly using props, and that was probably a good thing because it also makes it easier to come back and make mass adjustments. So for example, a lot of these lights for some reason stay on during the day. So to record cinematics during the day for this episode, I had to go through and delete like 99% of all the stuff that you've seen me put down over the last few minutes, which is not ideal. But having these as prop versions makes it super easy because you can just select all of them with Move It and delete them all in one go, whereas the IMT ones I had to go through and delete every single rule individually, which was not that fun. Maybe there's an easier way to do it, but I don't want to get too off track at this point. I think this is where all the lighting really starts to come together, and you can really see the outlines of the taxiways and the runways without actually being able to see the pavement or the lines. And that just really serves to bring out the complete and utter realism of this build.
Y si me dan a elegir, te elijo a ti para poder vivir. Te elijo a ti, es lo que me hace sentir. Te elijo a ti. Te quiero, 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 te quiero decir que te quiero, 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 te quiero decir, te quiero decir.
There are a few different versions of the green light network. I was using the high density one, so there were a lot more lights. I thought it looked a little too bright, a little too dense when I was done. So what you're seeing now is the after. I went back and replaced the high density version with either the medium or low density version. I don't remember exactly which one, but I think it looks more realistic this way. Now we also have these spots where the taxiway lights interact with the runway. These are apparently supposed to be alternating yellow and green lights, but because I didn't have single light props for the green versions, I decided just to do all green, so it's not totally realistic. But I think it's necessary to have some sort of lighting to show the taxiway lines leading on or off of the runway, so I think it's important to do something in this case. And now for the high-speed exits, apparently there's also sometimes an additional layer of lighting, which is a tapering set of yellow lights, so there's a set of 3, a set of 2, and then just a single one leading on to the taxiway center line. Next up, we have the Precision Approach Path Indicator, PAPI lights, and these basically indicate if you're on the proper glide slope as you're approaching the runway. So we have one of these for each runway. Apparently they're usually on the left, so I try to do that when possible, and when not, I move them over to the right side of the runway. One problem with doing this kind of lighting is that some of these lights are meant to be turned on and off or to flash based on certain conditions. So for instance, these stop bar lights, red line of lights across the stop bar is meant to be on if you're not supposed to cross, and then when you're given clearance to go onto the runway, they'll turn off. But that's not something we can do in this game, at least as far as I know. So what I do is only put these at some of the stop bars to give the indication that some of them are currently on and some of them are currently off. And then at the ones where I don't have the stop bar lights, I add runway guard lights, which is just a line of yellow lights. They're supposed to flash back and forth, basically just to notify you that you're about to go onto the runway. Since I can't do the flashing alternating lights, I just do steady orange lights. The concourses are already somewhat lit up. They have illumination maps in the buildings, obviously, and then they also have some lights on the jetways, but I thought it was still a little too dark, so I'm going to add a sprinkling of these just vanilla airport lampposts, which I think look pretty nice, and they serve their purpose to make it look nice and bright from a distance. You get this nice glow. One final stop for our lighting pass is going to be the approach lighting system. What I'm starting out here with is drawing out what the realistic distance for this line of lights should be. I'm not going to make the full length version because I don't want to have to delete that neighborhood in order to build this, but I am going to get rid of one road here to give us a little more space, and that way we can make a half scale one. So it's not going to be the official realistic length that it should be, but it's going to have the proper sense of scale, I think, and that's the most important thing. Maybe you can see what I mean here. This approach light asset is built to fit the vanilla runway. So even though we're not able to go full scale, we definitely needed to custom make this to get something that's more in line with the runway that we built. Also, these are supposed to be green, so I'm going to replace those really quickly. We have a few more miscellaneous builds to check off of our checklist before we complete the airport. First up is the fencing. When possible, I'm going to use IMT for this just to reduce the number of nodes that we're using, and I'm also going to use it as an opportunity to add some details as we go. So for example, along this 2-lane highway, I'm going to add some weeds, randomize it up a little bit in the IMT settings, so that we can get a little bit of growth here. Like, it's just not as well maintained as some of the other places, not as highly trafficked as some of the other places. And I'm just going to paste that all the way along this highway with IMT until we get to the bridge over here. As we go, I'm also going to detail up the shoreline and the perimeter of the airport aside from the fencing, because it does need a little bit of cleaning up. There's this big cliff that's been plaguing me basically all around the city due to an issue with the map when I made it years ago. So to bridge the elevation gap, I'm going to add a retaining wall, make some adjustments to the shoreline, just extending it out and smoothing it out, causing a tsunami, adding a rocky shoreline, and a nice touch of foliage here and there. Obviously, there's the whole issue of having foliage next to a runway. I'm basically just going with the precedent set by the San Juan airport, trying to include foliage about in the same place that you will find it at that airport. I also thought it would be cool to have a little pedestrian path or bike path along the highway as well. I didn't want to just upgrade this into a road with sidewalks because I only want it on one side. So I'm just adding a few rules with 2 barriers and 1 stretch of pavement using ploppable pavement. And then I can just copy and paste that once again along the whole stretch of highway. Then I can easily just take all these details I've set up and copy and paste them in chunks along the shoreline.
Bailar, bailar, bailar con mi corazón. Bailar, bailar, bailar con mi corazón.
This plain, undetailed bridge has been annoying me for quite a while, so we're going to detail it up really quickly, just copying and pasting our highway template, and also adding this bridge prop, turning it into a PO, darkening it to match the side of the highway asset, and dragging that all the way across the bridge. I thought about a few different ways to transition from the end of the runway here to the water, because we have this very steep slope, which is just not conducive to very good detailing generally. So what I ended up doing was taking inspiration from, of all places, LaGuardia. The runways here that stick out into the water, as far as I can tell, are basically just on these giant concrete peninsulas. So that's what we're going to do here. Just using some very, very basic retaining walls, ploppable pavement, and surface painter. And then because it does look a little plain, I'm going to make it look like there are giant slabs of concrete with these expansion joint decals. I'm also going to give it a layer of wear decals. I'm trying to compartmentalize where the wear decals are in order to emphasize the difference between the different slabs. I also did the same thing on this end of the other runway over here. So now that we've fenced in the entire airport and figured out exactly where the borders of the airport are, there are still some details within the confines of the airport that we need to do. I wanted to have these blast fences somewhere. I couldn't exactly figure out what types of situations they're used in, so I just put them where the jets would be passing by the highway and the service road right next to it as well. And presumably that'll keep people that happen to be nearby from being disintegrated, or something like that. We also have the instrument landing system. So we have this localizer thing that I'm just putting on the end of each runway. Then there's also the glide slope component. I don't really like the vanilla prop that I had. I don't think it matches the localizer. So I'm going to go ahead and make my own in PO. I'm just using the generic cube model, adding a color rectangle to cover it up, and adding a checkerboard of orangish squares so that you get this look of the sort of things you see. I guess anything really that's on the side of a runway close enough to present some sort of hazard is colored this white and orange, or white and red color. I'm just going to add a few details alongside it. Some dry grass decals to make it look like there's actually some activity of people going back and forth from the service road to the glide slope thingy. I couldn't find out exactly where these things are supposed to be located, so I put them pretty much at random places along the runways. The very last project for the international airport of Todos Santos is the cargo terminal. We're going to need a lot more space than we currently have though, so I'm going to move the people mover maintenance station out of the way and pull it over here so we have the maximum amount of space for the cargo terminal. I'm even going to have it straddling the road here, which I think looks kind of cool. Probably a little bit overkill in terms of infrastructure, but I just think it looks cool and it frees up the most space. I'm just going to detail this up really quickly, making it look like there's a supported tunnel underneath the building. Now with all of this space freed up, I'm going to build a cargo terminal inspired by one of the cargo buildings at the San Juan airport. go back and detail the plane stands in just a moment, but really quickly I realized that I had just enough space here to fit in a little general aviation area. So it's just a small hangar with a little building attached, a parking lot, and a few tiny little stop bars for our tiny little GA planes. As far as I can tell, there's only one prop on the workshop for this kind of small plane, so I'm just using the same one pasted over and over again. It's not the most detailed area ever, but I did want to fit this in somewhere, so I think it's better than nothing. Back at the cargo stands, we're going to do a little bit of detailing. Just like with the passenger planes, I'm going to try to have these parked planes look like they're in different stages of being loaded and unloaded. As far as I can tell, the process looks pretty similar to loading up luggage for a passenger flight, except you have these giant dollies compared to the smaller ones. And you also have these cool scissor lift looking vehicles that lift these heavy containers up to the level of the cargo bay. And also very similar to the passenger terminals is there's a whole bunch of clutter up against the terminal building itself. So I'm just taking different inactive variations of all these vehicles, plus a lot of the clutter vehicles and objects that I used for the passenger terminal, and arranging them all more or less randomly. Now these Airports DLC plane stands come with baked-in prop geometry, so I can't use BOB to remove any of these props. So I decided to replace them essentially with the ones I'm using by turning them into POs, resizing them to the correct size, and then covering up the baked-in props. And so it's still not perfect. I can't really get the variation that I'd like, but it at least makes them consistent with the props that I'm using for the rest of the stand decoration. And luckily, once I get one stand done, I can just copy and paste that to all the other ones. I'm also going to copy and paste these clutter details that I did and put them down over on the other side of the terminal as well, and then just add a few more miscellaneous details around the area, including a little bit of employee parking, decals to keep people out of the way of some of the operations here. And lastly, a little staging area over here where they're preparing a whole bunch of these dollies to be loaded on to the next flight. And believe it or not, that's the end of this super long video. So I want to say thank you so much for watching this, especially if you sat through the entire thing. I really, really appreciate it. If you liked it, you could like the video. If you want to see more, you could subscribe. I also have a coffee page, if you're willing and able to buy me a beer, or a coffee, or really any metaphorical beverage of your desire. Any of those would really help the channel out. Of course, all of the above are totally optional. Otherwise, enjoy the cinematics, and I'll see you on the next episode of Todos Santos.
Siempre soñé de tenerte aquí toda la vida juntita a mí, tanto amor tengo para ti, como el universo siempre se ha de expandir. Tanto amor, tanto, tanto amor, tanto, tanto amor, tanto, tanto amor dentro de mí. Aún sigo sintiendo tu corazón y ganas de vivir. Amo tu ser.